Hello, I'm Peter Wooders, and I'm here to speak to you today about fossil fuel subsidies, in particular with reference to the UK. A little bit on my background. I started my career in energy, which I've spent my whole career doing at British Gas Research and Development in London, and then I moved through a range of consultancies and worked for NGOs, most recently with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I was the director of the energy program, which also oversaw the Global Subsidies Initiative, which was set up by the ISD in order to identify fossil fuel subsidies around the world, and then to help governments to reform those that acted against sustainable development, which in our experience was the vast majority of those. So fossil fuel subsidies are an important topic. How big are they? Typically, in recent years, they've been around 500 billion pounds per year globally, a much higher value in 2022, where we saw the prices of oil and gas go up hugely on the world markets. And all fossil fuel subsidies ultimately lead to overconsumption. Overconsumption, therefore, means we get more climate change, more air pollution, and more of the adverse effects that we don't want to see, and that we have various campaigns and initiatives to work against. So how does the UK itself subsidise fossil fuels? I'll share my screen here and have a look at some of the figures. The cover page here, if you want to know a little bit more about the WTO and some of the options, I'll come on to that later in the discussion. Please have a look at this report that was just released and presented at the WTO last week. UK fossil fuel subsidies over the period 2010 to 2022 are shown in this figure. And typically, if we look at the numbers from 2016 to 2020, they've been around £12 billion per year. But then a huge spike in 2022 with the high oil and gas prices up to £40 billion per year, which is similar to the sort of the money that the UK government typically spends on either public order and safety, so policing and all the costs associated with that, or on its transport budget. So very significant numbers. Most of those subsidies are to consumers. So in the UK here, recently we've had about £10 billion per year spent to subsidise energy consumers. And again, that huge increase in 2022, particularly for natural gas, for home heating, and then also for electricity in the yellow in the graph there. Producer subsidies are smaller than those that are recognised in the UK, typically £2 to £3 billion per year, and roughly equally split between oil and gas. And then when we look at the specific measures of how the UK subsidises, these are the largest UK fossil fuel subsidies by value in 2021. So I haven't looked at 2022, as that's an exceptional year. And we see here the reduced rate of VAT for domestic fuel and power, £4.4 billion in 2021. Industrial relief against various taxes, £0.6 billion. Reductions and exemptions from the climate levy, another billion. And then some of the corporate income tax reliefs that oil and gas producers get, about £1.3 billion. And these are fairly typical types of subsidies that we would see in other countries. Generally, consumer subsidies are larger than producer subsidies, and all governments are seeking to support their poor and vulnerable consumers and their key strategic interests in terms of sectors or parts of the economy. So what's being done internationally to try and deal with some of these subsidies? We saw the G20, the group of the 20 largest countries in the world, all the way back in 2009, call for the reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that lead to excess consumption. So lots of caveats in that statement. That should have been done in the medium term, but most of those subsidies are still persisting. And we've seen similar asks from the G7, from the Sustainable Development Goals, from the UN climate change conferences, from the G7 and others. So some of these, many of these, the UK is party to. At the WTO, the World Trade Organization, based here in Geneva, where I'm based too, they have what's called the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. All the WTO members, 164 economies there, are party to that agreement, and that allows WTO members to launch cases against other WTO members to say that you are subsidizing unfairly and these subsidies should be removed. Unfortunately, to date, no cases have been launched against any fossil fuel subsidy in another member economy. And of course, that is a situation we'd like to see, or I would like to see, change over time. The WTO also has a number of other initiatives and discussion places. It has a Committee on Trade and Environment. It has a Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions series. And it's also recently launched what's called the FFSR Initiative, the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Initiative, which is aiming that its members should increase transparency, should look at crisis measures. What we saw, those huge extra subsidies that countries put in 2022, and should start to address most harmful subsidies. What do I think should happen at the WTO? I think there is a lack of global leadership on fossil fuel subsidy reform in the various initiatives, and the WTO can play a role here to provide some of that leadership, some of that coordination. It would be good if countries could share their information and experiences more. There's an opportunity for the WTO to put countries in touch with the organizations like the World Bank and others who can provide technical assistance and capacity building to help reform those subsidies. And then we can also look at the WTO for can groups of countries say, look, we've all got the same sort of problem here. We're all facing the same sort of political pressures. How can we move forward together in order to reform our fossil fuel subsidies? And there are a whole range of cooperative arrangements that could be undertaken there. I think to summarize here, fossil fuel subsidies act against sustainable development. They're bad for climate change. They're bad for government budgets. And in the default, we should have the feeling and the idea that all fossil fuel subsidies should ultimately be reformed. We can start by concentrating on the largest ones. They tend to be the subsidies that go to residential consumers, to transport consumers, and to the production of oil and gas. Transparency, I noted before, if we know as informed citizens what the subsidies are in a country, then we can have an informed public debate. And there is very little information that's provided by governments themselves on subsidies. It'd be good if that could change. Ultimately, when we think about the reform of fossil fuel subsidies, that means we don't want to, if we're giving a subsidy to a poor group of consumers, then we still want to support them, but we can do it in other ways without using fuel prices. We can give them money directly through their budgets, through reduced bills, whatever it may be, through bank transfers. And that's a more efficient way of doing things, and it gets rid of the overconsumption that fossil fuel subsidies lead to. And then whatever subsidies that we do have left, the huge ones that were given out to all households in 2022 in the UK, just give those to the poorer households. And if we were better prepared next time there's a price spike, then we would have the opportunity to enormously reduce the budget there and get the benefit just to those who really need it. So fossil fuel subsidies are a very important topic. There's still a lot to do on the reform side, but countries have very similar concerns and solutions, and there's a great opportunity here for countries to work together. Thank you for your attention today.